The autumn wind whistled through the weathered boards of Redemption Creek's main street, carrying with it the scent of dust and dying dreams. Ruby Mae Collins pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried past the general store, ignoring the disapproving stares of Mrs. Henderson and her quilting circle. Their whispered condemnations followed her like shadows, but Ruby had learned long ago to let such poison roll off her back like rainwater. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the end of the street, its painted sign creaking in the wind. Ruby pushed through the bat-wing doors, grateful for the familiar embrace of tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes. At least here, nobody pretended to be something they weren't. "Ruby Mae!" called out Sal Murphy, the saloon's burly owner, from behind the bar. "Doc Morrison's been looking for you. Says it's urgent." Ruby's stomach tightened. Doc Morrison never sought her out unless someone was dying or dead. "Did he say what about?" "Nope, just that you should get yourself over to the parsonage quick as you can." Sal wiped down a glass with his dirty apron. Looked mighty serious, if you ask me. The parsonage sat adjacent to the small whitewashed church, a modest wooden structure that had seen better days. Ruby hesitated at the gate, her hand trembling on the latch. Respectable folks didn't take kindly to her kind visiting their preacher, especially not in broad daylight. Doc Morrison answered her knock, his weathered face grave. "Ruby, thank God you came. He's been asking for you specifically." "Who has?" Ruby stepped inside, removing her worn bonnet. "Reverend Hartwell, he's not got much time left, child. The consumption's taken hold something fierce." Doc's voice dropped to a whisper. "He keeps saying he needs to speak with you before he meets his maker." Ruby followed Doc through the sparse parlor to the small bedroom where Reverend Samuel Hartwell lay propped against pillows, his once robust frame now gaunt and hollow. His eyes, though sunken, still held the gentle warmth she remembered from their brief encounters on the street, moments when he'd tip his hat and offer her a kind word while others looked away in disgust. "Miss Collins," the preacher's voice was barely above a whisper, but his gaze was steady. "Thank you for coming." Ruby approached the bedside uncertainly. "Reverend Hartwell, Doc says you asked for me? Sit, please." He gestured weakly to a wooden chair beside the bed. "What I'm about to ask of you will seem strange to most folks in this town. They'll question my judgment, perhaps even my sanity." A fit of coughing seized him, and Doc Morrison quickly moved to support him. When the coughing subsided, the preacher continued, "But I've watched you, Miss Collins. I've seen how you care for old Pete when he drinks too much, making sure he gets home safe. I've noticed how you share your meals with the beggar children behind the mercantile when you think nobody's looking." Ruby's cheeks burned. "Reverend, I don't know what—" "You have a good heart, child. A pure heart, despite what this town might think of your circumstances." His eyes held no judgment, only compassion. "That's why I need you to do something for me. Something nobody else in Redemption Creek would have the courage to attempt." The preacher reached under his pillow with shaking hands and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "This letter needs to reach my daughter, Sarah. She lives in Silver Ridge near the Apache reservation. It's a 3-day ride through dangerous territory, and the Apache have been restless lately." Ruby stared at the letter, understanding dawning on her. "You want me to deliver this? The stage doesn't run that route anymore. Too many attacks. No man in this town would risk it for the likes of me, not when I'm already dying." His voice grew stronger with determination. "But you're a survivor, Ruby Mae. You've endured things that would break most people, yet here you are, still fighting, still caring for others." "But Reverend, why me? Surely one of the deacons would refuse the moment they learned where it needs to go." The preacher's eyes closed briefly. "Besides, this letter, it contains truths about my past that I'm not proud of. Sarah needs to hear them before I die, needs to understand why I abandoned her and her mother all those years ago." Ruby took the letter with trembling fingers. "What does it say?" "That her father was a coward who chose the bottle over his family. That I drove away the only people who ever truly loved me." Tears gathered in the old man's eyes. "She deserves to know the truth, and to know that despite my failures, I never stopped loving her." The weight of the envelope seemed to increase in Ruby's hands. "Reverend, I'm honored that you'd trust me, but the people in this town will call it scandalous that a dying preacher would entrust his final wishes to a saloon girl." The Reverend reached out and grasped her hand with surprising strength. "Let them talk, child. Their opinions matter less than a soul finding peace before death." Ruby looked into his eyes and saw her own desperate need for redemption reflected there. Perhaps this was her chance to prove that she was more than what Redemption Creek believed her to be. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll get your letter to Sarah." The preacher smiled, and for a moment his face seemed to glow with an inner peace. "Bless you, Ruby Mae Collins. You truly are an angel in disguise." Word traveled fast in Redemption Creek, carried on whispers that grew louder with each retelling. By sunset, the entire town knew that their dying preacher had entrusted his final sacred duty to Ruby Mae Collins, the Silver Dollar's most notorious resident. Ruby sat on her small cot above the saloon, staring at the sealed letter in her hands. Through the thin walls she could hear the angry voices gathering in the street below. Mayor Winston Caldwell's booming voice rose above the rest. "It's an abomination! A dying man's fevered delusions, nothing more!" Caldwell declared to the growing crowd. "We cannot allow this woman of ill repute to represent our community, our faith." "Reverend Hartwell was always too soft on sinners," added Mrs. Henderson, her voice sharp with indignation. "But this crosses every line of Christian decency." Ruby moved to the window and peered through the dusty curtains. At least 30 townspeople had gathered, their faces illuminated by torchlight, expressions twisted with righteous fury. She recognized the banker, the schoolmarm, several ranchers and their wives, the very people she served drinks to when their husbands weren't watching. A knock at her door made her jump. "Ruby Mae?" It was Sal's voice, unusually gentle. "Doc Morrison's here to see you." She opened the door to find both men standing in the narrow hallway. Doc Morrison's face was etched with concern, while Sal looked ready for a fight. "That mob's getting worked up something fierce," Sal said, jerking his thumb toward the window. "Caldwell's talking about going to the preacher himself, demanding he change his mind." Doc Morrison stepped forward. "Ruby, I need you to understand something. Reverend Hartwell is dying. He has maybe hours, not days. Whatever decision you make about that letter, it needs to be made soon." "They want to stop me," Ruby said quietly, clutching the envelope tighter. "They want to preserve their own sense of propriety," Doc replied with disgust. "They'd rather let a dying man's final wish go unfulfilled than let their neighbors see them accepting help from someone they've deemed unworthy." The sound of heavy boots on the outside stairs interrupted them. Mayor Caldwell appeared at the top of the stairway, flanked by Deacon Williams and 2 other church elders. His face was flushed with anger and exertion. "Miss Collins," Caldwell said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm here to collect the letter you took from Reverend Hartwell. This misguided request will not stand." Ruby straightened her spine, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "The Reverend gave this to me freely. It's not yours to take." "A man on his deathbed, addled by fever and medication, is not capable of making sound judgments," Deacon Williams interjected. "We, as the church leadership, have a responsibility to intervene." "Funny how his judgment was sound enough when he married your daughter last month," Sal growled from behind Ruby. "Or when he blessed your business ventures, Caldwell." The mayor's jaw tightened. "This is different. We cannot have the sacred trust of our church placed in the hands of a woman of your profession, Miss Collins." "What profession is that exactly?" Doc Morrison stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "The profession of serving drinks? Of surviving when life knocked her down? Or are you referring to the profession of showing kindness to those this town has forgotten?" Ruby felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. "I've never claimed to be perfect, Mayor Caldwell, but I gave my word to a dying man, and I intend to keep it." "Over my dead body," Caldwell's composure cracked. "I'll have the sheriff arrest you for theft if necessary." "On what grounds?" Doc Morrison demanded. "The Reverend gave her the letter willingly. I witnessed it myself." "The grounds of protecting this community's moral fiber," Mrs. Henderson called from the stairway, having climbed up behind the men. "That woman has no business representing our church, our faith, or our town." Ruby looked at the faces surrounding her, faces filled with disgust, fear, and judgment. These were the same people who had watched her family lose their farm to drought and debt, who had done nothing when she had nowhere else to turn but the saloon. They had written her off long ago, yet now they demanded to dictate her actions. "You talk about moral fiber," Ruby said, her voice growing stronger. "But where was your Christian charity when I was 16 and starving? Where was your community support when I begged for work at every respectable business in town?" The group shifted uncomfortably, but Mayor Caldwell pressed on. "Your past misfortunes don't justify your current choices." "My choices," Ruby laughed bitterly. "You mean the choice between starvation and survival, the choice between the streets and a roof over my head." She held up the letter. "Or maybe you mean the choice to honor a dying man's wishes instead of bowing to your hypocritical judgment." Deacon Williams cleared his throat. "Miss Collins, surely you can see that this task would be better handled by someone more suitable." I volunteer to make the journey myself. Through Apache territory? Ruby challenged. When was the last time you sat a horse for more than an hour, Deacon? I'll go, declared Jim Patterson, one of the ranchers. It's no job for a woman anyway. The Reverend didn't ask for volunteers, Doc Morrison said firmly. He specifically chose Ruby Mae, and he had his reasons. Mayor Caldwell's face darkened. Then he was a fool, and we won't be party to this madness. He turned to Ruby. Miss Collins, I'm ordering you as mayor of this town to surrender that letter immediately. Ruby looked at the letter in her hands, then at the hostile faces surrounding her. In that moment she made her choice, not just about the letter, but about who she wanted to be. No, she said simply. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Mayor Caldwell's face turned purple with rage. Then you leave me no choice. Sheriff Morrison will be informed, and if necessary, we'll take that letter by force. Sheriff Morrison is my nephew, Doc said with a slight smile, and he takes his orders from the law, not from your moral outrage. As the confrontation intensified, none of them noticed the small figure that had appeared at the bottom of the stairs, a young Mexican boy named Miguel who swept floors at the saloon. He listened for a moment, then disappeared into the night, running toward the parsonage with news that would change everything. Miguel burst through the parsonage door without knocking, his small chest heaving from his sprint across town. Reverend Hartwell, he gasped, finding the dying man still propped up in his bed, though noticeably weaker than before. Miguel? The preacher's voice was barely a whisper. What brings you here, son? They're at the saloon. Mayor Caldwell and the church folks. They're trying to take the letter from Miss Ruby. The boy's words tumbled out in a rush. They say she ain't good enough to carry your message. Reverend Hartwell's eyes flashed with a strength that seemed impossible for a man so close to death. Help me up, boy. Reverend, you shouldn't. Help me up. The command came with such authority that Miguel immediately moved to support the frail man. My coat, over there on the chair. Meanwhile, back at the Silver Dollar, the confrontation had grown uglier. More townspeople had gathered, their voices creating an angry din that filled the narrow hallway. Sheriff Tom Morrison, Doc's nephew, had arrived but seemed reluctant to take sides. I don't see no crime being committed here, Uncle, the young sheriff said carefully. The lady was given something freely and she's keeping it, that's her right. She's defying the will of the community, Mayor Caldwell thundered, and corrupting the final wishes of our spiritual leader. Ruby clutched the letter protectively, backing against the wall of her small room. The crowd had pushed inside now, filling the cramped space with hostile energy. She felt trapped, cornered, like a wild animal. Please, she said, though she knew it was futile. Just let me honor his wishes. That's all I want to do. Your wants don't matter here, Mrs. Henderson spat. Decent Christian folks won't stand by and watch you make a mockery of everything we hold sacred. And what exactly do you hold sacred? A new voice asked from the doorway. Every head turned. There, supported by young Miguel and looking like death itself, stood Reverend Samuel Hartwell. His nightgown hung loose on his skeletal frame, and his face was pale as parchment, but his eyes burned with righteous fire. Reverend, Deacon Williams stepped forward. You shouldn't be here. You're gravely ill. I'm dying, Williams, there's a difference. The preacher's voice carried a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his failing body. And apparently, I need to remind you all what Christian charity actually means before I meet my Maker. Mayor Caldwell found his voice first. Samuel, you're not thinking clearly. The fever, the medication. My mind is crystal clear, Winston. Clear enough to see the ugliness that's festered in the hearts of this congregation while I've been lying in that bed. The Reverend's gaze swept across the assembled crowd, and several people shifted uncomfortably. You dare speak of Christian values while persecuting a woman who has shown more Christ-like compassion than the lot of you combined. She's a saloon girl, Mrs. Henderson protested. So was Mary Magdalene, the preacher replied sharply, and Christ didn't hesitate to accept her devotion. That's different. How? The Reverend's voice rose, though it clearly cost him great effort. Because it happened 2,000 years ago? Because it's easier to love the sinners in Bible stories than the ones living right here among us. Ruby felt tears streaming down her face. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever seen her as worthy of defense. Reverend Hartwell, she whispered, you should be resting. I'll rest soon enough, child. He looked at her with infinite tenderness. But first I need these people to understand something. He turned back to the crowd, his voice growing stronger. For 5 years, I've watched Ruby Mae Collins live the gospel better than most of my congregation, She feeds the hungry, clothes the poor, and comforts the afflicted, often with her own meager resources. She serves liquor and associates with questionable men, Deacon Williams stammered. She serves drinks to survive, you pompous fool. And those questionable men you speak of? They're the same ranchers and businessmen sitting in my pews every Sunday, pretending to be saints while they frequent the very establishment you condemn her for working in. The accusation hit home. Several men in the crowd looked at their boots, while their wives' faces reddened with embarrassment and anger. I've made my choice, the Reverend continued, his breathing becoming more labored. I've entrusted my final earthly duty to the one person in this town I know will see it through, regardless of the cost to herself. That woman is Ruby Mae Collins, and my decision is final. You can't be serious about sending her into Apache territory alone, Sheriff Morrison said, genuine concern in his voice. It's suicide. Then someone should offer to accompany her, the preacher replied. But I suspect the same people who question her worthiness won't risk their own necks to ensure my letter reaches its destination. Uncomfortable silence filled the room. The Reverend was right. Not one of them had volunteered to make the dangerous journey themselves. This is madness, Mayor Caldwell muttered, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. No, Winston. Madness is standing here arguing while a dying man's daughter waits 3 days away, never knowing that her father loved her after all. The Reverend's legs began to give way, and Miguel struggled to support him. Madness is letting prejudice and self-righteousness prevent an act of mercy. Doc Morrison pushed through the crowd to help his patient. That's enough, Samuel. You've said your piece. Now let's get you back to bed before you collapse. But the Reverend wasn't finished. With his last reserves of strength, he looked directly at Ruby. Don't let them stop you, child. Sarah needs to know, needs to understand. His voice broke with emotion. Tell her I was sorry. Tell her I loved her mother until my dying day, and I loved her too. Tell her the bottle was my master, not my choice, but that's no excuse for the pain I caused. I will, Ruby promised, her voice thick with tears. I swear I will. The preacher smiled, and for a moment peace settled over his tortured features. Then I can die knowing I did at least one thing right. As Doc Morrison and Miguel helped the failing man toward the stairs, the crowd began to disperse, their righteous anger deflated by the preacher's passionate defense. But Mayor Caldwell lingered, his face dark with frustration. This isn't over, Miss Collins, he warned. That man may be dying, but I'm still mayor of this town. And I'm still the woman he chose, Ruby replied, finding courage she never knew she possessed. That letter will reach Sarah Hartwell, with or without your approval. As the last of the crowd filed out, Ruby was left alone with Sal and the sheriff. The silence felt deafening after all the shouting. Ruby, Sheriff Morrison said quietly, I can't officially stop you from making this trip, but I also can't protect you once you leave town. You understand that? I understand. Then you also understand you'll likely die trying. Ruby looked at the letter in her hands, thinking of the broken man who had entrusted her with his most precious burden. Some things are worth dying for, Sheriff. The Reverend taught me that tonight. Dawn broke grey and cold over Redemption Creek, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like harbingers of trouble. Ruby Mae stood in the stable behind the Silver Dollar, saddling the only horse she could afford, a weathered bay mare named Honey that had seen better days, but still had heart. You sure about this, Ruby? Sal asked for the 10th time, his weathered face creased with worry. It ain't too late to change your mind. The Reverend's counting on me. Ruby checked her saddlebags one final time, making sure she had enough jerky, hardtack, and water for the 3-day journey. Besides, he passed peacefully in his sleep 2 hours ago. This letter is all that's left of his earthly concerns. Doc Morrison emerged from the shadows, carrying a small bundle. Ruby, take these. He handed her a medical kit and a bottle of laudanum. Apache arrows can be nasty if they find their mark, and there's no telling what else you might encounter out there. Doc, I can't afford... It's not for sale. It's a gift. He pressed the items into her hands. That old preacher saw something special in you. Maybe it's time the rest of us started looking harder. Ruby felt tears threaten but blinked them back. She couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when the hardest part lay ahead. Miss Ruby! Miguel came running into the stable, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Mayor Caldwell's got men watching the main road. He says he'll stop you from leaving town if he has to arrest you for horse theft. Horse theft! Sal exploded. That mare's been Ruby's for 2 years. I sold her to the girl myself. He's claiming she can't prove ownership, Miguel explained breathlessly. Says a woman of her reputation probably stole it. Ruby's jaw tightened with determination. She'd expected Caldwell wouldn't give up easily, but she hadn't anticipated this level of vindictiveness. "Then I'll have to find another way out of town. The old mining trail," Doc Morrison suggested. "It runs behind the cemetery and connects with the Silver Ridge Road about 5 miles north. Rough going, but it'll keep you away from Caldwell's men." "That trail's been abandoned for years," Sal protested. "Could be washed out, blocked by rock slides." "It's better than facing down armed men who think they're doing God's work," Ruby replied grimly. She swung into the saddle, feeling the familiar creak of worn leather. "If I'm not back in a week, assume the worst." "Ruby Mae Collins, you listen to me." Sal grabbed her stirrup, his voice thick with emotion. "You may not be my blood, but you're the closest thing to a daughter I've got. You watch yourself out there, you hear?" "I will, Sal, and thank you for everything." Ruby guided Honey out of the stable and through the back alleys of town, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The cemetery lay on a small hill overlooking Redemption Creek, its weathered headstones casting long shadows in the early morning light. She paused at the fresh grave where Reverend Hartwell would be buried later that day, a simple wooden marker that would soon be replaced with proper stone. "I won't let you down," she whispered to the empty grave, then spurred Honey toward the old mining trail. The path was every bit as treacherous as Sal had warned. Years of neglect had allowed brush and fallen trees to block sections, forcing Ruby to dismount repeatedly and clear the way. Honey picked her way carefully over loose stones and around washouts, her hooves finding purchase where a lesser horse might have stumbled. By midday they had covered only 10 miles. Ruby's hands were scratched and bleeding from moving debris, and her back ached from the constant tension of navigating dangerous terrain. But when she finally reached the point where the mining trail rejoined the main road, she felt a surge of triumph. She had made it past Caldwell's roadblock. The landscape ahead stretched endlessly, rolling hills covered with scrub brush and punctuated by towering red rock formations. In the distance, heat waves shimmered like ghosts, and Ruby knew that somewhere beyond the horizon lay Apache territory and the dangers that awaited her there. She allowed herself a brief rest, sharing water with Honey while she studied the letter the Reverend had entrusted to her. The envelope was worn and yellowed, addressed in faded ink to Sarah Hartwell, Silver Ridge Trading Post, Arizona Territory. Ruby wondered what secrets it contained, what words might finally heal the wounds between a father and daughter. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up sharply. 3 riders were approaching from the direction of Redemption Creek, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Ruby's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Mayor Caldwell himself, flanked by 2 of his cronies. "Miss Collins?" Caldwell called out as they drew near. "I thought we might find you here." Ruby stood slowly, keeping her hand near the old Colt revolver she'd borrowed from Sal's collection. "Mayor, you're a long way from town. Not as far as you're planning to go." Caldwell dismounted, his face red from exertion and anger. "This foolishness ends now. I won't have the reputation of Redemption Creek tarnished by allowing a woman of your character to represent our community in Apache territory." "The Reverend's daughter doesn't live in Apache territory," Ruby replied calmly. "Silver Ridge is a legitimate trading post." "On the edge of the reservation," one of Caldwell's companions spat. "Might as well be in the middle of Geronimo's camp." Ruby studied the 3 men, noting that they were armed but looked uncomfortable with the situation. These were townsmen, not gunfighters, clerks and shopkeepers playing at being lawmen. "I gave my word to a dying man," she said firmly. "Nothing you say or do will stop me from keeping it." "Then you force my hand." Caldwell reached for his gun, a clumsy movement that betrayed his inexperience with weapons. Ruby's Colt cleared leather in one smooth motion, practiced from years of defending herself in the saloon. "I wouldn't, if I were you." The 3 men froze, suddenly realizing they had cornered a woman who knew how to use a gun. Caldwell's hand hovered near his holster, his face pale with shock. "You're making a mistake, Miss Collins," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "When word spreads that Redemption Creek's saloon girl held honest citizens at gunpoint, word will also spread that 3 grown men tried to rob a woman traveling alone," Ruby interrupted. "I wonder which story people will find more shameful." For a long moment, the 4 of them faced each other in tense silence. Then Honey nickered softly, reminding Ruby that time was wasting. She backed toward her horse, keeping the gun trained on the 3 men. "Tell the good people of Redemption Creek that Ruby Mae Collins kept her word," she said as she swung into the saddle. "And maybe, just maybe, they'll learn something about honor from a woman they thought had none." Without waiting for a response, she spurred Honey into a gallop, leaving the 3 men standing in the dust. Behind her, Mayor Caldwell's voice carried on the wind. "You'll never make it back alive." But Ruby Mae Collins was already focused on the road ahead, where a dying father's love waited to find its way home to a daughter who had been lost for far too long. The sun was setting blood red over the canyon walls as Ruby Mae crested the final ridge before Silver Ridge trading post. 3 days of hard riding through scorching heat and treacherous terrain had taken their toll. Both she and Honey were exhausted, dusty, and running dangerously low on water. But they had made it. The trading post, nestled in a natural depression between towering sandstone cliffs, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden corrals that served as a lifeline for travelers brave enough to venture this close to Apache territory. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Ruby could see people moving about their evening chores, blissfully unaware of the drama that had brought her here. As she guided Honey down the steep trail, Ruby's thoughts turned to the letter tucked safely in her saddlebags. For 3 days, she had carried not just an envelope but the weight of a father's regret and a daughter's unknown pain. Soon that burden would be lifted from her shoulders and placed where it belonged. The trading post's main building was larger than she had expected, a sturdy adobe structure with a covered porch and several windows glowing with warm lamplight. A painted sign above the door read, "Silver Ridge Trading Post, S. Hartwell, Proprietor." Ruby dismounted stiffly, her legs protesting after days in the saddle. A young Apache boy emerged from the stables, offering to tend to Honey with the casual ease of someone accustomed to travelers from all walks of life. "Thank you," Ruby said, pressing a coin into his palm. "She's been a good horse. Give her extra grain if you have it." The boy nodded and led Honey away, leaving Ruby to face the door that would change everything. She straightened her dusty dress, ran her fingers through her tangled hair, and tried to make herself as presentable as possible. Then, with the letter clutched in her trembling hand, she knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair streaked with premature grey and green eyes that held depths of sadness Ruby recognized all too well. She wore a simple blue dress, practical and worn, but her bearing spoke of quiet strength and dignity. "Yes?" the woman asked, studying Ruby with curious but not unfriendly eyes. "Are you Sarah Hartwell?" "I am. Sarah Hartwell Morrison, actually. I married a few years back." The woman's expression grew cautious. "May I ask who you are and what brings you to Silver Ridge? We don't get many visitors, especially not women traveling alone." Ruby took a deep breath, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "My name is Ruby Mae Collins. I've come from Redemption Creek with a letter from your father." Sarah's face went completely white. She gripped the doorframe for support, her knuckles showing stark against the weathered wood. "My father, Samuel Hartwell." "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid he passed away 3 days ago, but before he died he asked me to bring this to you." Ruby held out the envelope with shaking hands. For a long moment Sarah simply stared at the letter as if it might bite her. Then, with obvious effort, she composed herself. "Please, come in. You must be exhausted after such a journey." Ruby stepped into a cozy main room, filled with the comfortable clutter of a successful business. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from ammunition to bolts of cloth. A stone fireplace dominated one corner, its flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn furniture. "Sit, please," Sarah said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "Can I get you something? Water? Coffee? You look like you've been through hell." "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Ruby sank into the chair gratefully, suddenly feeling every mile of the journey in her bones. As Sarah busied herself at the stove, Ruby studied the woman who had been nothing more than a name on an envelope just moments before. She could see traces of Reverend Hartwell in her daughter's features, the same gentle eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw. But there was a hardness there too, the kind that came from years of disappointment and abandonment. "I haven't heard from my father in 15 years, Sarah said without turning around. "Not since the day he chose whiskey over his family and walked out of our lives forever." Ruby winced at the pain in the woman's voice. "He spoke of you often in his final hours. He carried a great deal of guilt about what happened." "Guilt?" Sarah's laugh was bitter as she poured coffee into 2 chipped cups. "Guilt doesn't put food on the table or comfort a child crying for her papa. Guilt doesn't explain to your mother why the man who promised to love her forever decided she wasn't worth staying sober for." She set a cup before Ruby and took the chair across from her, but made no move to take the letter. "Why did he send you? Are you his wife? Companion?" Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks. "No, ma'am. I work at the Silver Dollar Saloon in Redemption Creek. Your father asked me to bring this because—" She struggled for the right words, because he said I was the only person brave enough to make the journey, and the only one who would understand what it meant to be judged by your past instead of your heart." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A saloon girl? My father sent a saloon girl to deliver his final message." "I know how that sounds," Ruby said quietly. "The whole town was scandalized. They tried to stop me from coming, said I wasn't worthy of representing their precious community. But you came anyway." "I gave him my word. And despite what people think of me, my word means something." Sarah studied Ruby with new interest, taking in the travel-stained dress, the scratched hands, the determined set of her shoulders. "It must have been dangerous, traveling alone through this country. The Apache have been restless lately, and there are bandits who prey on lone travelers. Your father said you needed to know what was in this letter before he died. He said it contained truths he wasn't proud of, but truths you deserve to hear." Ruby leaned forward, extending the envelope once more. "Whatever pain he caused you, whatever mistakes he made, he loved you. That much was clear in his final hours." Sarah's hand trembled as she finally accepted the letter. For a long moment, she simply held it, staring at the faded ink that spelled out her name in her father's familiar handwriting. "I used to wait for him to write," she whispered. "Every day for the first 5 years after he left, I was sure he would remember that he had a daughter who needed him. He never forgot," Ruby said gently. "The guilt of leaving you consumed him. He told me he drove away the only people who ever truly loved him." With careful fingers, Sarah opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. As she read, tears began to stream down her face, tears of anger, of grief, of a pain too long buried finally finding release. "He says," her voice broke, "he says he knows he has no right to ask for forgiveness, that the bottle was his master, not his choice, but that's no excuse for abandoning his family." She looked up at Ruby, her face wet with tears. "He says he loved my mother until his dying day, and that not a day passed that he didn't regret walking away from us." Ruby remained silent, letting the woman absorb her father's words, his pain, his desperate need for absolution he knew he didn't deserve. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. "He says he became a preacher to try to atone for his failures as a husband and father, that he spent 15 years serving others because he couldn't find the courage to face the family he had destroyed. He was a good preacher," Ruby offered quietly. "He helped a lot of people find their way back to God, but he never found his way back to us." Sarah folded the letter carefully, holding it against her heart. "Still, I'm glad he sent this. I'm glad he found someone brave enough and kind enough to bring it to me." "He saw something in you that others missed, didn't he?" Sarah asked suddenly. "That's why he chose you." Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Then he hadn't lost his gift for seeing into people's hearts, despite all his other failures." Sarah stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she withdrew a small daguerreotype, a family portrait showing a younger Reverend Hartwell with a beautiful woman and a small girl with pigtails. "This is the only picture I have of us together," she said, showing it to Ruby. "I used to hate looking at it, but now I think I can remember the good times without letting them be poisoned by what came after." As the evening wore on, Sarah insisted that Ruby stay the night before beginning her journey home. Over a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, they talked about Redemption Creek, about the preacher's final days, and about the courage it took to honor a promise when the whole world stood against you. "You know," Sarah said as they prepared for bed, "my father was right about one thing. You are brave and kind and worthy of respect, no matter what narrow-minded people might think." Ruby felt tears she had been holding back for days finally spill over. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." The next morning, as Ruby prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a small package into her hands. "For your journey home, and Ruby Mae Collins. Yes, tell the people of Redemption Creek that Sarah Hartwell Morrison forgives her father, and that she's grateful, truly grateful, that he found someone like you to carry his final message home." Ruby mounted Honey with a lighter heart than she had carried in years. The letter had found its destination. A daughter had found peace with her father's memory, and Ruby Mae Collins had found something she had never expected to find, proof that she was worthy of trust, of respect, and perhaps even of love. The journey back to Redemption Creek would be long and dangerous, but Ruby no longer feared what waited for her there. She had kept her promise to a dying man, and in doing so had discovered that sometimes redemption comes not from seeking it for yourself, but from helping others find it for themselves. As she rode toward home, the letter's mission complete, Ruby Mae Collins knew that she would never again be just a saloon girl in the eyes of those who truly mattered. She was a woman who kept her word, who faced down danger for the sake of love, and who had helped heal a family's broken heart. That, she thought as the trading post disappeared behind her, was worth all the judgment in the world.